We're live.
Welcome to this year's Tabula Poetica reading series. As you can see, we're hosting this year's events entirely online and we'll be experimenting as we go. We are live streaming on YouTube, which will add closed captions after the event. That's also where you can find an array of video recordings of previous Tabula Poetica talks and readings. We also encourage you to follow Tab Journal on Facebook and Twitter. Today, we've invited students in classes reading the work of the visiting poets to participate via Zoom so that they can post questions and comments in the chat and participate in the Q&A portions of these events. We ask that the students keep their microphones muted while the poet is speaking, but you are welcome to put questions in the chat during the event and we'll do the Q&A at the end of the reading. My name is Anna Leahy and I direct Tabula Poetica and also direct the MFA program at Chapman University. This fall, Tabula Poetica is hosting 3 visiting poets today, of course. The other dates are October 19th and November 9th, so mark your calendars for those. And we finish up in December with a reading by Chapman University's own emerging poets. Genevieve Kaplan is here this evening and she has done an amazing job as guest curator of this series. And I am deeply grateful to the work she's done to bring these particular poets into our ongoing conversation of all things poetry. Most of the support for both the visiting poets and for Tab Journal comes from the English department. And this year from a special faculty opportunity funding grant for the journal. I especially want to thank our department chair, Joanna Levin, our administrative assistants, Kristen Laxo and Samantha Della O, and graduate assistant Jason Thornberry. And I will add that Samantha joined Chapman shortly before the pandemic, and she has stepped up to the task of figuring out how we were going to do this Tabula Poetica series. So special thanks to Samantha. This year, Tabula Poetica received grants from poets and writers to support our visiting poets. While in-person gatherings around poetry have long fostered a sense of community here at Chapman University, we're also excited this year to invite poetry readers from everywhere into our conversation. I also want to mention that Michelle, our poet this evening, has a book, and I encourage you when you attend any literary event online that you consider purchasing the book. And we can put the link for a purchase into the YouTube comments as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Genevieve Kaplan, who will introduce the poet.
Hi, everybody. I'm Genevieve Kaplan, and I'm here today to introduce Michelle Brittan Rosado. My internet is being just a little bit fuzzy, so somebody message me if it goes out, but I'm going to do my best. So I'm delighted that Michelle is here with us tonight to kick off our Fall 2020 Tabula Poetica series. Michelle Brittan Rosado is the author of Why Can't It Be Tenderness, which won the Felix Pollock Prize in Poetry and was published by the University of Wisconsin Press. Her chapbook, Theory on Falling into a Reef, is available from Anhinga Press. And like Anna, I encourage you to purchase these if you don't have them already. They're excellent. Michelle's poems have been published in Alaska Quarterly Review, Indiana Review, Poet Lore, and the New Yorker, as well as in anthologies including Only Light Can Do That, 100 Post-Election Poems, Stories, and Essays, and Ink Knows No Borders, Poems of the Immigrant and Refugee Experience. Michelle's poems are thoughtfully and beautifully crafted, guiding readers through ranges of everyday landscapes and reflective emotions. In our class discussions about Why Can't It Be Tenderness, students observed her careful attention to line and form, her deceptively simple feeling descriptions, and her desire to recognize the identity of the self while also exploring one's cultural inheritances. Earlier today at her craft talk, Michelle spoke about how she's been influenced by anthropology and sociology, and her comments about studying the self in an autoethnographic way as a way into writing poems really resonated with me in terms of thinking about both the poems in Why Can't It Be Tenderness and the newer poems that she's been working on in this strange time of pandemic and isolation. Michelle earned her MFA in creative writing from CSU Fresno and her PhD in literature at the University of Southern California. She's received awards and fellowships from the Academy of American Poets, Community of Writers at Squaw Valley, the Sustainable Arts Foundation, USC Center for Trans-Pacific Studies, and the Vermont Studio Center. While at work on her second collection of poems, Michelle is book titled The Pantoum Across the Pacific, the Circumnavigation of a Poetic Form. Please join me in welcoming Michelle Brittan Rosado.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Viv, for that introduction, and to Anna and Samantha for all of your work, all of you and those of you at Chapman University who've come to the talk earlier, and it's so good to see so many of you here, to see your faces and your names. Yeah, this has been a really lovely day. So I've got mainly poems from my book to read, and I also wanted to share a couple new poems that are in my manuscript in progress, and looking forward to talking about any of these or other poems that maybe I don't get to read, but looking forward to having a conversation afterwards. I thought I would open with the first poem in the book called Ode to the Double L. And it sits outside of the two, like the book is split into two sections, and this poem sits outside of those two sections, almost like a preface. And I should also give a little bit of background on the inspiration of this poem. It has an epigraph crediting Araceli Sturmey. She wrote a poem called Ode to the Little R, which is Googleable, so definitely recommend reading it. And it's to the R in her first name. And so I just loved this idea of writing an ode to a letter that's part of your name, and using that as this door into identity or autobiography and self. So I took that upon myself as a poem prompt, and that's how I came to Ode to the Double L, because my first name, Michelle, has two L's, and I feel like that's like a part of my name now. Is I meet people or I go into a place and they're asking me, you know, for a dinner reservation, what's your name? And I say Michelle with two L's. So that's kind of where this poem came from. Ode to the Double L, after Araceli Sturmey. Twin shorelines at the end of my name, traffickers of white space. You could last on the tongue forever, lolling, longing, an endless drawing out of the little stream between you. Fill my life. I drink from the narrowest canal, flowing between two countries that half of the time claim me. Double L, bring me back to the in-between, where my breath has always lived without containment, like two legs pointing toward the ocean, or these arms reaching into sky. From birth, you have doubled my grief and my wonder. Show me the parallel which can never touch, the way I run alongside my love without entering his true mind. Rivulet of secrets, slim as a eucalyptus leaf, airplane runway of the heart. Double L, let my days always move in two directions. Build me a channel into which I can pour this voice. After I wrote that poem, it was kind of towards the end of putting this manuscript together that would become a book, or that was my hope. And I'd been struggling with the organization of the book so much. It was in like 6 sections at one point, and then I think it went to 3, and then I wrote that poem, and I was like, obviously this should be in 2 halves. And I write about being mixed race, bicultural, and so it finally made sense to me. So the first half of the book are poems that have a lot to do with the place that I grew up in, Vacaville, California, which is in the northern part of the state. It kind of has itself sort of a mixed identity of like, it's kind of Central Valley agricultural, but it's also kind of Bay Area. It's like 65 to 70 miles outside of San Francisco. So it's like a commuter town, but it's also very agricultural. And I wrote this poem called Pastoral with Restless Searchlight. And the epigraph is letting you know that it's in Vacaville, California. And I've been thinking a lot about this poem because in it is a grass fire. And that was something really normal in my childhood, for there to be fires in the summer, because we'd have these rolling hills of grass and pastures, and then it would get triple digits, and then we would have fires. But like the kinds of fires we've been having this year and a couple of years back are just like completely out of the ordinary. So I've been thinking about that. So you'll hear a little bit about fires in this poem. I was raised with the ocean over my right shoulder and the jagged mountains filling my left hand with teeth, while overhead, the military jets drew their temporary scars. In this valley, I rocked myself like a marble at the bottom of a bowl. Then I gathered my skirt of drought, of failing plants. When I slept, the crop dusters laid down their thin quilt, and my life shortened, though barely. I counted my luck among the deer drawn down the hill by the prison's light. I wanted to be like the dried grass alighting suddenly on a summer afternoon, a fire started by nothing but sun, a helicopter's oracle foretelling the blackened acre, like a hole cut into fabric behind which always breathes the tangible dark. I wanted to be like that, to swallow fences, to listen for the animals crossing over, the night's highway crowded with the footsteps of the anonymous. This next poem is called Customs, and it's not in the poem itself, but I was imagining it at the San Francisco International Airport, which growing up kind of in that area, that was our closest big airport. And every 5 years-ish, my parents and I would visit my mother's side of the family in Malaysia. And this poem came from my experience of going through customs, coming home, and how there would be, and if you've gone on international flights, you may have noticed this, there's usually two separate lines for citizens and non-citizens. And my first trip was when I was 4, and I remember that kind of being my first understanding of like, that there was this real difference in my family, like even maybe more so than traveling across the globe to see another side of my family, but seeing that my father and I stood in one line, and my mother, who was a resident, alien resident with a green card, would stand in a different line. And so at 4 years old, kind of understanding that people were grouped in that kind of way. So this poem is about that, and it's called, again, Customs. At the airport, after a long journey, a mother and father divide like a cell, foreign and domestic, into their respective lines for citizens and non-citizens. The child is small enough to run beneath the rope that skims the top of her skull, splitting her family into parallel routes to the same house. The girl passes from line to line beneath the gaze of the customs officer. No one has caught her yet, going back and forth. She swings like a spider between 2 points, building something nearly invisible. Go to the other side with your father, says the mother. As tall as suitcases, boxes at eye level, the girl becomes a piece of luggage in transit. She has nothing that can be confiscated. She doesn't even hold her own passport. The adults slide it across the appropriate counter for an off-center stamp on an unmarked page. Already, she no longer resembles the child's photo, iridescent and cross-hatched by the advanced security features covering her face. Even her name has an expiration date when someday she is married and will change it. For now, the child belongs to no one and no country. Everything is impermanent. Her loyalties might shift according to a game she makes of jumping over the dark tiles in the airport floor. Thanks for the air claps. This next poem is actually the title poem of my chapbook that came out 2 years before the full length, if I can find it. And it's called Theory on Falling into a Wreath. And it's a persona poem. So the I speaking in the poem is not me, but maybe it's me. But it's really like inspired by Amelia Earhart. And I remember this was maybe in 2015-ish or 16-ish, when I had read an article that said there had been a new, at that time, theory that maybe she had lived. And of course, she's the woman pilot who flew over the Pacific but didn't make it to the other side. And it was, mysterious what happened to her. But they believe that they found evidence that she did survive, that her plane had crashed on an island and she survived for some time before succumbing to the elements or not having any food. So this poem kind of has like a post epigraph. I don't know if that's really a term. It's not exactly a footnote. Like I wanted there to be an epigraph, which is, the text that's after a title that's italicized, but before the poem really begins. And I wanted this to be like for someone to be able to read the poem first and then have the epigraph. But when I read it aloud, I always read it. So it's newly discovered aerial photographs of Gardner Island, now Nicomaroro in the South Pacific, suggest Amelia Earhart may have died there before its habitation and the arrival of colonists. This is Theory on Falling into a Wreath. I survived on clamshells, a shallow hunger. Half my skeleton appears in the sand, the other stays mine. Pieces of a bottle, lone button, jar without its lid. What washed away? Most of the letters in my name. Beside the place I last woke, a rusting nail, and not the thing that came apart. I'll read the last poem of this section and then switch to the second half of the book. This one is called My Dead Live in Two Rooms. And it kind of came to me like this idea of what if in the afterlife people are still separated from each other, like by language or geography or space in some kind of way. My dead live in two rooms. I stagger my visiting hours. I shuffle my blood like a deck of cards I keep passing across the table for someone else to cut by half. In the afterlife, there's no international dateline, no jet lag. Still, I crack the spine of the phrase book where it is written that my only fluency is being an outsider. I knock on the window panes so they know it's me, cousin to many, and nobody's sister. The only time they talk to each other is in my head. Somehow we all speak the same language, or nothing is ever said, only the thoughtful pause after someone is kind and there is no use rushing into the lonely hallway of a single voice. So those poems kind of set, I guess, a sense of self and place in the book. And then the second half of the poems investigate relationships, relating to others with this background of being mixed race, being kind of split or divided. So this poem that I'm going to read next is called Incident Between Two Exits. And it takes place, my memory of this takes place on the 405 here in LA, and getting into a car accident. And I was fine, but it was scary at the time, especially for a small town girl from Vacaville, you know, like where the division between cities is like what crop is grown between like Vacaville and Dixon and Davis. And here it's like, maybe the font on the street signs change. So, you know, very different relationship to driving up there versus here. Incident Between Two Exits. While the seatbelt unfurls a lilac bruise over my chest, ribbons of smoke rise from the crushed hood, tail lights staining them in monochromatic reds before releasing into dust. The destroyed horn sounds a single note announcing my life's continuation. Skinned knees below the dashboard, single-seated pew, and the abstract mosaic suddenly formed across the windshield, all radio hush in the cathedral of my brain. What words could I mouth to the drivers tarrying to witness? What could I possibly say from the interior of a burst bloom of silver? I was complete. I counted my fortune on both sides of the center divide, those innumerable sequins of glass. So I have, I started with this ode to the double L, and I have one other ode in the book, and it's just a very, I'm fond of odes because they are a song or a celebration, and I love when they are used for things you don't expect. I think of like Neruda's odes, like these little things that we might take for granted. And I remember I was lying in bed one night, as I sometimes do, thinking about silly things during the day that I wish I had said differently or done differently, but that really don't matter. And then my brain wasn't satisfied with those things. So then I started thinking about things needlessly from the past. And then I turned that into a prompt for myself. And I said, what if I wrote an ode to my mistakes? Would I feel differently about them? So I made that a challenge for myself. And I actually remembered the next day. Usually when I'm lying in bed and I have poem ideas, I don't remember the next day. And then I'm kicking myself that I didn't just jot it down. But I remembered, and I said, okay, I'm going to write an ode to my mistakes. So this is called Mistaken Ode. I have made so many mistakes, lucky to have been mine. Oh, how I relive them, middle of the night looped reels of them. I call them back to me. I must not leave any of them out. All the crayons in the right place. I am working toward a complete set. My shelves are filled and alphabetized. I take armfuls with me for company on road trips. We sing harmony together the whole way to nowhere. I look for mistakes hitching on the side of the highway with tidy bindles of self-loathing. I commit their stories to memory. I give them all nicknames. Feeling that wasn't love, doomed marriage, kicked dent in a car door after a fight. I take them down from a cabinet to polish them every Sunday. I hoard them like animals. I keep photos of them in my wallet and show strangers in waiting rooms. My mistakes love me back with a feeling so pure I get dizzy. How did I get so fortunate? No one has mistakes like mine. People ask, where did you get that? And I make up exotic locations, though I suppose my mistakes are as common as Target brand napkins, repeating patterns on the tissue of my brain. My mistakes are so absorbent, I can wipe up a small one with a bigger one and temporarily forget the small one. But now the dark water of my mistakes wrung out in a bucket. I wash my windows with them. I set them out like jewelry in the evenings in infinite combinations, and they all turn my wrist screen. There's no use pawning them because I'd buy them all back. I wear them the next day, and the next, and the next. It kind of worked. It kind of made me feel better about things. This poem is called Visitations with Unmarried Self, and it's about my experience of changing my name, or like I like to think of it as adding to my name. When I got married, I added Rosado, which is my husband's last name. So I went through life as Michelle Brittan, and I knew I wanted to keep Brittan as a middle name. So then I added Rosado, thinking like, it's just like hitching another train car at the end. Like it's me, but with more added now. And, but of course, like a lot of places don't use middle names for things. So I remember like that first year of being married, like hearing people ask for Michelle Rosado, I was like, who is that? And then I would get mail for both people's names. I took forever to like change everything over. It's like a whole process. For those of you who've done that, you've known that, you know this, but I feel like that year of transition of names was like a weird middle space to exist in. So I felt like I needed to write my maiden name a poem, like she gets her own little elegy. And this poem came from that. So this is titled Visitations with Unmarried Self. You keep coming back, the maiden name on grocery store mailers, special offers from magazines I subscribed to in another life. I hardly recognize you. You don't even know you're a ghost, slithering from mouths and out-of-date medical records, pacing waiting rooms invisibly until I answer for you. You are still registered to vote, believing you are part of the future, where you cast your wishes into the great uncounted. You are like the dead who cannot understand how time moves on without them. I tell you this in public bathroom mirrors while I press our faces together. Or you are like a child following the mother absorbed in the list of things she piles into a cart. Her life is an eclipse moving slowly over yours, which you can only watch swallow the light, your one belonging. It's over. It's over, the long illness of being your own. Everyone gathered to say goodbye in dry cleaned skirts and rented suits, confetti clutched like ash. Over my shoulder, I threw to you flowers, but already you entered me and I was possessed. I blanched then, white as a dress. Don't worry, I did update my voter registration, so I can vote. It's okay now. Yeah, so I'm going to read the last poem in the book, and then I'll read a couple new ones too, or maybe one new one, because I think I'm getting close to time. So this is the last poem in the book, and I wrote it as I like to share a little bit of the backstory on it. It was a prompt from a friend. We were doing a writing workshop kind of retreat all together, a group of maybe 4 or 5 of us poet friends who had met each other in our MFA program, and this was like several years after the plane. So we all got together and wrote poems for a couple days. And I always forget all the parts of the prompt, but it was like, it had to have something from nature in it. It had to have an I statement. It had to say something philosophical. It had to have race in it, and like an inanimate object, something like that. So you'll hear all those different elements in here. This is called Lullaby, in which it becomes impossible not to talk about race. All night, the rusted water heater rocks gently on its side, useless in the dried grass. I imagine even ideas must sleep sometimes. Race, for instance, has a recurring dream of a bathroom mirror in which none of our faces are changed by history. Meanwhile, most of my waking life has been spent trying to remember if the moon is waxing or waning. At any moment, I can never tell if I'm disappearing into myself or at the edge of something that could alter the whole sky. So that's where the book ends. And I wanted to read one poem that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And I wrote it 4 years ago during the last presidential election. And I've been thinking about how much has transpired in 4 years. And it was really surreal for me in my personal life because I was 7-8 months pregnant in November 2016. I have to like do the math there. And so I have a 3-year-old son now. And I remember watching the debates pregnant and like wondering what kind of world I'd be bringing my son into. And then at the same time, this was in a previous residence, our house was being painted that we were renting. And so it just happened to align with like with election day. And well, actually like the weeks leading up to it, all of our windows were papered like with brown paper so that they wouldn't get paint on the wrong things. And so it was like living in this like weird womb. It was like being in a womb and like there was no like natural light coming in and it was taking them forever. And it just felt like I was living that way in this like dark uncertainty. And then literally like the morning after waking up and it's still being dark and then going to teach and then coming home and all the paper was gone. And I walked into the house and everything was just like way too bright. So that was the influence for this poem. And I've been thinking about what would be if I could write a sequel to this poem, you know, what would it be? I don't know, that's sort of on my mind right now. So this is called Poem to My Unborn Son, the Morning After the Election. And this will be my last poem. Since November began, the painters have been here, stirring their mixtures, preparing for the days ahead, laying down the dark canvas around the grass perimeter outside. First, they papered the windows so that in here, when I wake, I can't be sure my eyes are fully open. In the partial light, I make my way through the familiar interior, now suddenly made strange. I count the steps to the kitchen, am careful in passing through doorways, slip my body down the hall without touching anything. I think your life thus far must be like this, all subtle movements in the semi-dark, my skin half illuminated by day, then a shade pulled down at night. I read that this is the week your body takes on pigment, the blood red burrowing beneath fat, beneath skin, becoming closer to the color you will learn to wear in a world that will have to decide whether to love you or fear you for it. This is the truth about where we are as the men work outside, the ladders against our walls like sudden thunder. We ready ourselves to be altered completely. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Michelle. That was beautiful. I had read your book, of course, and I like the poems even better now, and I liked them a lot before. I think Genevieve is back with us. So Genevieve, you want to give the Q&A a go?
I'm gonna give it a go. Yeah, I'm gonna do my best here. And if I cut out, then Anna's gonna take over and you all can just talk without me and I will go listen on YouTube. So yes, thank you so much for your reading, Michelle. It was so nice to get to hear the poems from Why Can't It Be Tenderness, and then also some of your new poems. I've been looking at the questions in the chat here, and I thought, given what you just read, it might be nice to start with Sarah's question about location. Sarah, do you want to ask it or do you want me to just read it from the chat? Speak up if you want to ask it, otherwise I'll just...
Yeah, I can ask it real quick. Yeah, I was just saying, I like how specific you are about location in your poetry. I was wondering if a majority of your poetry, you know, if it has a special place attached to it. I was thinking specifically about Between on page 20, because you don't have a written location, but did your mind go anywhere specific when you wrote it?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. So it's funny, like this poem, I think specifically came from either a real or an imagined urging from some colleagues in workshop. And it probably was even just like a very benign thing where someone might have said like, you know, you write a lot about these like literal locations, specific locations. And then I think I just projected onto that. And I was like, I write about location too much. So then I was like, well, if I write something that's not in a location, like where is it? Where is the poem? And so I think this poem, to me, I think of it as it exists like in a dreamscape or in the mind or in the psyche, like it exists somewhere internal, you know? And so I think I have a couple poems like that. I think also the ekphrastic poems, so the poems that are about visual art, also exist in that kind of way where it's like this sort of other landscape, like an internal landscape. And I think I did something similar, like, because I write a lot about location and I use first person I, you know, a lot. So then that's where I was like, I think I need to write some persona poems, like the Amelia Earhart poems. So I was just thinking about those obsessions that I have, which I think location is one and first person is another. And then thinking about like, how can I take this poetic obsession of mine and try to like stretch it into a new direction that isn't necessarily trying to like disown it completely, but kind of like expands the boundaries of what I can do with that part of my writing, my inspiration.
Oh, that's such a good answer. I mean, I love the idea of expanding boundaries and how you can push at the things that you like to do to take them further. I think that that's a really exciting thing about poetry. So I think you articulated that really, really well too. I want to, there's a couple questions that kind of overlap, so I'm going to sort of hybridize them for you. They're both kind of about form. So Kate asked, could you discuss how you select your line breaks, for instance, in the poem Ambivalence, which I think you read earlier in the craft talk today. And then Sam was asking how and in what stage of the process do you decide on the form you want a poem to take? So maybe if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with poetic form, because I know that you explore a lot of forms, and also like at what stage in the writing process do you make those formal decisions?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And I think I sort of have two answers because Ambivalence, that poem is a little bit different from my other ones. It has super, super short lines. And part of the reason for that, and if you are reading along in your, I feel like this the hymnal, if you're reading along in the book, Ambivalence is on page 12. And you might have noticed that many of the words in the poem are actually words, and I'm blanking right now on what this is called, like what this literary move is called. Maybe Viv, you might remember, or Anna, but I take the word ambivalence, and I think I actually used like an online word scrambler, and it told me what words would come out of ambivalence, like if you rearranged all the letters. So it gave me this list, and I knew, I don't even remember where I know I got that idea from somewhere. I didn't make it up all by myself. But I remember thinking about the word ambivalence and how much I liked it, and how it was a long word, and I could see where it would have different words within it. So words like manacle, maniacal, balance, name, I am, of course, the poet nerd in me was really excited that I am was in there. Bale, veins, vial, viable, navel, became, cable, and enclave. All those words come out of the word ambivalence. And so I wanted to have really short lines in that poem so that the person reading it, whether aloud or in their head, would maybe, even if they didn't know that they would hear those sounds over and over, and that it would create a different kind of experience. But if you didn't catch that, I don't think it's like necessary for the poem, but it was part of the process. But besides that poem though, which I think is sort of its own like little animal, the other poems, in the way that I wrote this book, which was pre-motherhood, and my writing process has changed dramatically since having a kid. But I had like handwritten everything into a little bound journal. And so I would handwrite, and anytime I just saw what looked like a good line break, just because I liked the tension between two words, I would write in a slash, but I would just keep going. So usually I would just write in paragraphs, but like insert the slashes. And then I didn't officially decide on the line breaks until I got to the revision process, where I would type it up. And sometimes I would just handwrite over and over my revisions, because I felt like that was really good for my process, just to like just really decide on each word each time I rewrote. But then when I felt like my hands had done what it could to the poem, then I would type it up. And then once I saw it, then the line breaks would inevitably change. But I usually think about them from the beginning, because I think space is really important to me in the things that I write about. So I really care about what's broken from each other, what's separated.
That's great. I know we talked a little bit about revision and the workshop process too during your craft talk this afternoon. And I think that the suggestion of handwriting your poem, or handwriting it over and over until it says something to you or becomes its own animal, I think that's a great suggestion too of a technique that we could try. And I think that also segues nicely into this next question that I'm looking at over here, that is from Ansley, who, maybe I'm saying your name right, maybe not. If you want to ask it, pop up on the screen, and otherwise I can read it. But it's about study habits and recommendations for MFA students.
Yeah, I can ask my question. Thanks for being here, Michelle. I was just wondering what tips you would have for us as grad students. What like writing practices or study habits or like revision tools, things that you remember that were like really helpful for you while you were in grad school?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking that question. I feel like writing process, at least my feelings about it, are that it can be really personal and unique to the individual. And so what I share may not fit for you or for anyone here, or maybe just one other person might resonate with. But like, I had always heard the advice, which never worked for me. I had heard like, make a writing routine, always write at 5 a.m. in the morning to make sure that you always have some time for writing that nobody will take away. And like, I'm not a morning person. Like on those rare mornings where it works for me, you know, I love it, because I'm like, well, I have all this time. But I just could never get that to work. And so I don't have like a regular writing process. I write when I'm inspired to write. I feel like then I'm excited about what I wrote, because it really came from somewhere that felt authentic and real. But I would say during my MFA, I was writing really regularly, I think because I was reading so much. And so that is something that I think maybe is a little bit more universal, is like reading as a part of the writing process. Like especially now that I've written a book, like I think about books being in conversation with other people, but as a reader, like just having whatever book I'm currently reading along with my journal or whatever I'm using, whether I'm typing or whatever, and just having, if not a conversation with the book that I'm reading, but the themes or an image or a word that they use. So that has always been really generative to me. And I know I've heard things from colleagues, or not too often from colleagues, and this is like from my MFA days, but sometimes I hear this from creative writing students I've had where they feel kind of nervous about that, like, oh, but if I am reading other people, will I sound too much like them, or will I accidentally plagiarize or like borrow too much? And I don't know, I just don't think that'll happen. And I have a lot of faith that like our voices are they just have to come out. So I think that's how I was able to write semi-regularly during my MFA, pretty regularly. And then, yeah, just writing and figuring out what my process is. I shared during the crap talk this afternoon that I love writing in public. I love writing in coffee shops, which I think can be kind of like a romantic stereotype about writers, but then also there's the hermit that lives in the attic and like drinks and nobody sees them for days on end. But no, I love like being in community with others, which is what kind of makes this pandemic a little bit hard for me in my creative process, because I really like to people watch and be nosy and eavesdrop and notice things about people. So I'm figuring out my new ways of writing. So now I walk a lot and I try to observe outside safely as I can.
Safely. Yeah, we're all finding the new ways, and yeah, they're very unexpected. I think that for the next question, I kind of want to combine two again, and part of it is from Constance and the other part is from Caesar on YouTube, who wanted to know about how you grew up and your experiences with your parents and your son, how much of an influence your family has had on your poetry. And then Constance's question was, I don't know, Constance, if you want to ask it yourself, pop up over in here.
Yeah, I can go ahead and just ask. I found it, especially the customs poem that I had already kind of obsessed over in the book, and then was really happy that you ended up reading it here today. I very, very deeply related to it, and I'm very obsessed in my writing with this concept of remembering and memory, present, past, and future, especially when it comes to matters of migration, where you're talking about a memory that's yours, but also your parents probably. And so I'm kind of wondering, when you write about this, how much of it is memory and how much of it is projection, and if you try to be faithful to the feeling that you remember having as a child, or if you kind of bring yourself into this past. And then if this even matters, like if this even matters at all for like the process of writing.
Yeah, thanks for that question, and I'm happy to hear the poem resonated with you. I would say like a big part of my sense of what poetry owes to like truth, like with a big capital T, was really shaped by my time in my MFA program, which was at Fresno State. And we had 3 genres. We had creative nonfiction, fiction, and then poetry. And that sort of triangle gave me this sense of permission that I didn't need to be nonfiction and I didn't need to be purely fiction either, that poetry could live in this in-between realm that wasn't like beholden to the facts, but also didn't need to create something wholly like fabricated. Like, so I really enjoy that middle space. And I think too, that's also reflected in maybe even my feelings about like identity and fluidity and like just trying to be comfortable in that middle ground. So I would say I think about memory and just like even things that I see that connect me to something that I've experienced or read about or whatever. And then I don't worry too much about how like true or accurate it is in terms of like the material, like specific details. Like I remember there's like a year in one of my poems, and I changed the year just because like I wanted it to be an odd number and not an even number. So like sometimes I just change things just because I feel like the poem asks for it. But as long as it's still conveying like a human truth or feeling, that's not necessarily like in the historical record, but like it's something that just feels true about being human and alive, and I know that I've felt it, it kind of doesn't matter what the vessel is that is holding that feeling, like how that is described. It's just like what could carry that like on the page. So yeah, I think I take a lot of liberties or wherever I need to. And also even I would say like poems where maybe I don't change a lot, I still put a lot of mental effort into feeling like this poem exists outside of me because I'm sharing it with other people. Like in a way, it can't be mine anymore. It's mine if it like stays in my journal and I never share it with anybody and I just have this personal relationship to it. But I know that once I share it with other people, people are gonna notice different things, maybe even things I didn't intend, but like now that's their poem. So in a way, it almost doesn't matter how much it's like true to my feeling or experience. Like I'm really more interested in that meeting place that is created between the reader and the writer, which I think is a lot more interesting than maybe what exactly happened.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I feel like you articulated that so well. We talked a lot about in my class last week after reading your book about the middle lines in your poems and how things come together and how there are so many binaries and so many meeting points. And so I don't know, it's fascinating to hear you articulate it in different ways than we had also mentioned it, which is, I don't know, it's pretty cool. So I can see also that some of the questions are coming in about that at the group chat. I feel like we have time for maybe like one more question. And a couple people have asked about influence, what books are exciting you in terms of making you excited to write? What do you read when you are stuck or like when you feel like you're not quite sure where to go next? Maybe you could give us some suggestions or tell us something that has worked for you in terms of like getting out of the poetry rut, getting excited about poems again.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, something that I love about social media, especially as a poet, I feel like poems can be very shareable. Like you can take a picture and upload what you're reading as an Instagram story, or someone takes a photo and they share it on Facebook. And I have to say, like, I get a lot of poem recommendations through like friends who are also poets and what they're reading, and then I go find that book. But I would say like also for me, as when I was in my MFA program, and I was also kind of like figuring out who some of my favorite writers were anthologies. Like I just loved picking up an anthology and understanding that poetry is huge and vast, even if there's an editor who kind of hand selects things. So maybe there's some sense of like a through line because of their aesthetics, but you know, you picking up an anthology, and even if like out of 30 or 40 poets, you know, maybe most of them don't quite, you know, resonate in some kind of like really magical way, but you find that one or two or three where it's like, oh my gosh, they've like articulated something that I've always felt that I didn't have the words for. Then it's like, now that's like opened all these doors to what has that person written? Oh my gosh, they have 3 books, they have 4 books, and then like finding all their books. And then I also would read their acknowledgements pages, because I feel like the poetry world is so small and like so many writers know each other. And so they might give people shouts out, and it's like, oh, like maybe these people kind of write about similar things, or they went to the same program, or they, you know, are kind of like the similar group in some kind of way. So those are like ways that are sort of like general paths that I've found to discover writers that excite me. But yeah, I mean, I just found through classes too, like a poem gets assigned to me, and then I want to find out what else that writer has done. So a group of poets that like absolutely has influenced me, even before I got to Fresno, when I was doing my my BA actually in sociology and anthropology, which we talked about earlier. I was at the University of Puget Sound. I was taking these poetry classes as electives on the side. And I had a professor, Hans Ostrom, who was also from Northern California, even though this was in the Pacific Northwest. This was in Tacoma, Washington, but I lucked out and I had a poetry teacher who's also from Northern California. And he taught a lot of California poets, especially Fresno poets. And I didn't even know it at the time, but he was teaching like Philip Levine, Gary Soto, Brian Turner had just had his book come out, Here Bullet, and he's an Iraq War veteran. This was like in the mid 2000s. And I loved their work, and I didn't even know that they were all from Fresno. And so I remember talking to my professor about where should I apply for MFA programs, and he said, you should apply to Fresno because you like all those poets that come from there. And I had no idea, and I said, Fresno, really? And yeah, so now like there's been some Fresno anthologies. So that's like a school of poetry that I love to return to, because there's a sensibility there that that rings true for me. And even though Fresno and where I grew up, Vacaville, is like 200 miles apart, they're both kind of in the same, California is a big state. So, you know, they're both sort of in the same-ish region. And so some of the descriptions of the landscape, the grapevines, the rows of almond trees, like all those things also sound very familiar to me. Yeah, in my childhood. So yeah, location too. I would say like poets that are come from your hometown or where you grew up can be really inspiring, because there may be things in your life. I didn't think there was anything poetic about Vacaville, but you know, once I saw other people writing about similar landscapes, I realized like it has its own mythology. And so yeah.
Great. Those are such great suggestions. I feel like I don't know, the life of finding new poets is really, it's a combination of luck and then also perseverance. And so the suggestion of like, if you see one poem that you like, go read more by that person. Or if you see like, I always look in the acknowledgements page too. So I'm like, oh, if everyone's getting published in Alaska Quarterly Review and I like their work, maybe I should go read that journal. So I think like looking for those commonalities and then sort of seeking them out. And I love your idea about poems of place too, looking at the place and see who's been writing there. That's so much fun. Well, we are just about out of time, so I want to thank Michelle for being here. Thank you so much for coming out to Chapman University virtually. We're all giving her a round of applause. You can't see it, but we can see it. So thank you so much, Michelle. Thank all of you for joining us on Zoom and on YouTube. It was a pleasure to spend the evening with you and to have poems.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. And thanks for being such a wonderful audience.
Yeah, I want to remind everybody too that Michelle Brittan Rosado was the very first poet in our Tabula Poetica series this fall. We will have 2 more visiting poets. Angela Pena-Redondo is coming on Monday, October 19th, and Brent Armendinger on Monday, I'm looking at the calendar over there, on Monday, November 9th. So save the date and come back and find us on YouTube, and we'll be happy to bring those poets for you then. Have a great night, everybody.